Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We're continuing the Wings adventure, and it is getting closer to the ending of the band Wings, and it's kind of sad because it's been fun to watch how this whole idea came about and how Paul built a successful band when he had serious doubts about himself. So let's see what happens next in this edition of the group. McCartney II came out. After the disappointing Back to the Egg album, Paul decided to do a recording of an album all by himself. So this was the summer of 1979, and the sessions turned out to be the McCartney II album that was released in the 1980s. And then bad news happens. Jimmy McCulloch passed away. September 27, 1979, Jimmy McCulloch was found dead in his London apartment. Jimmy's brother Jack had stopped by to pay him a visit, and he thought he smelled something burning. He broke into the apartment and found Jimmy sitting in a chair, and it looked like he was watching TV. According to the Band on the Run book, a pathologist found that Jimmy had been smoking pot and drinking alcohol, but he died from a huge dose of morphine. Inside the apartment were no traces of alcohol or drugs. It seems like someone else may have been in the place before his brother broke in, because the security chain on the door had been ripped out, and it wasn't done by his brother. And no cash was inside the apartment, and police felt like the place had been cleaned up after McCulloch's death, but no leads on who it could have been. It appears that Jimmy was thinking of future things because he had called Steve Hawley and asked him if he was interested in doing a recording with him. Hawley agreed, and he was waiting on Jimmy when he heard the bad news. The housekeeper, Rose, who was the McCartney's housekeeper, went to the funeral, but no members of Wings were there. The band Stone the Crows and Maggie Bell went. Denny debated about whether to go to the funeral, but he and Jimmy had their falling out, and he decided to stay at the studio. His wife JoJo, though, she went. So Paul wanted to start touring again, even though Back to the Egg didn't turn out to be the album he wanted it to be. So this made the other band members happy because they would finally have work and make the money they needed. The only one not happy with the prospect was Linda. She just wanted to stay in their country home with the kids. Paul wanting her to be in the band put a strain on their marriage, and Paul later admitted that it did. The first thought that it would be a small venture like when Wings first started out. Instead, it became a major tour of 20 dates in Great Britain from late November to December. And the shows never went as smoothly as Paul had hoped. There was a power failure at the Edinburgh Odeon concert, and the band treated it as a joke, though. Denny went into a mock striptease and was doing acrobatics, and Linda got the audience in a sing-along with the horn section they were playing When the Saints Go Marching In. And then the show got back to normal when the power came back on, but nobody knew what Paul was doing during this time. Critics reported the concerts weren't as polished as the previous world tour, and they selected songs that weren't as well known to do at the concert. They had Linda's Cook of the House, Paul's Hot as the Sun, that was from his first solo album, and Denny did Again and Again and Again. It seemed, according to the review in Rolling Stone, that the show was designed to take the spotlight off Paul and spread him on the rest of the band, but I find that strange because it was Paul's idea to get back to touring, and he was never one that wanted to stay out of the spotlight. Well, Paul thought that the band wasn't rehearsed enough, and then one day when the drummer went to Paul and Linda's dressing room and complimented them on the show, Paul said it sucked. One magical moment happened at the Apollo Theater in Glasgow. When the band came back to do an encore, Paul started to play the opening chords to Mull of Kintyre. Then the Campbelltown bagpipers took the stage, and the crowd rose to its feet. Next, a holiday song is created. During the tour, Paul released a holiday song. John Lennon had created Happy Christmas, War is Over, and it became a holiday standard. George Harrison released Ding Dong, Ding Dong, and it was the top 40 song in 1975. Wonderful Christmas Time was recorded earlier in the summer without Wings. It was a top 10 hit in Great Britain. I have to admit, at that time, I didn't really like the song, but now it's one of my favorites. It grew on me. I think the synthesizer didn't appeal to me then, but now I really like it. I guess the song for me was a little ahead of its time. The year 1979 ended on a high note for Paul, so Wings was the top record seller of the decade, and their 1975-76 was one of the three best tours of the 1970s, but the band wasn't going to last much longer. Well, 1980, Paul tries to see John Lennon. Paul and Linda were in New York and had spent a belated holiday with Linda's family. So one day, Paul decided to phone up John to see if he could stop by and visit. Yoko answered the phone and said it wasn't a good time. They were too busy for company. According to the book Band on the Run, it wasn't known if John ever knew that Paul had called. Now we're getting to the Japan nightmare. Paul and the band finally had permission to play Japan after they were refused during the 1975-76 tour. I can't believe it, but when customs went through Paul's bag, they found a plastic bag that had 7.7 ounces of marijuana. You would think that Paul would have known better than to try to do something like that when he was probably going to be under a microscope. But people close to Paul and Linda felt that it wasn't Paul's stash but Linda's, and that she packed it without his knowledge. As he was led away, Paul said, "It's all a mistake." The band had been waiting on the bus, and they didn't know what was happening, and they had been told that there was a minor complication and were taken to the hotel. Linda called Steve Hawley to tell him that Paul had been arrested. Hawley thought it was a joke, and then he realized that she was serious. Next, Linda called her family frantic. Paul knew that possession of pot in Japan was a serious offense. 5 years for possession and 7 years for smuggling, plus a fine. He could have faced 8 years in prison. The government started by banning all Wings songs from national radio and television stations. Of course, the Japanese tour was canceled, and all the other countries that they were going to play were canceled as well. Everybody was given a refund, and Paul had to pay for half the rentals and promotional expenses, and it cost him more than £500,000. Well, the money was taken away from Paul, but also the other Wings members. They got their weekly salaries, but lost out on tens of thousands of dollars that they could have made doing the concert. So there was no reason for the band members to stay in Japan. So they headed back home, and of course Linda stayed in Japan. And Denny was angry over the whole thing and wrote a song and recorded it with his former bandmates Henry McCulloch and Denny Sewell. And they called the song Japanese Tears. It was about a Japanese Wings fan who had her heart broken by Paul's arrest and not being able to see the group perform. Denny was angry at Paul and Linda, and it lasted several months, and he was disappointed about it years after. Paul said later, "The band members were all annoyed with me rather than sympathetic, because me being busted had blown one of their big paydays. They weren't too happy with me. But I think Wings was really finished in my mind then. It sort of lost its charm. It wasn't fun anymore, and the bust had definitely sort of cemented that. It was like, oh God, who needs all this?" But Paul waited several months before making a final decision. So what really happened regarding the marijuana? Paul spent 10 days in jail and then was deported and headed back to Britain. Paul stated he was dumb. He had just come from the United States and had the American attitude it wasn't so bad. He didn't appreciate how strict the Japanese were about it. He said he decided never to touch the stuff again, but of course that wasn't true, so later Paul and Linda would be busted in coming years. And it's rumored that Linda had the drugs, and a source said the Japanese custom men believed that Linda was the possessor and had started to question her when Paul claimed responsibility. But I find that one hard to believe, because I think Linda would have said something immediately if it had been her. Another source said that Paul was acting suspiciously as he went through customs, so that led them to search the luggage. Well, maybe Paul once again forgot that he had that, or just realized, well, maybe that amount was larger than they would have liked, and was starting to get nervous. And then John Lennon felt that Paul had been set up. He felt like the customs official may have planted the marijuana on Paul for the purpose of publicity or notoriety. And then there was another rumor that Yoko made phone calls to a relative of hers in Japan who had connections with customs, and that she alerted this relative that the McCartneys may have marijuana in their possession. But I don't believe that she would have done that. Paul was helpful to her in getting John to speak with her when their marriage was in trouble, and she also knew how close John and Paul were. So Yoko denied it, and she wrote a letter along with John to the Japanese authorities requesting Paul's release from prison. This episode of Wings was one where everything went wrong. They lost a former bandmate. Back to the Egg was a disappointment. The new tour wasn't as fun or successful as the years before, and the worst thing that happened was the trouble in Japan. This incident put a wet blanket over everything. Paul and Linda went through the stress of the arrest and worried that Paul might be spending years in jail there. The band members lost a lot of money when the tour was canceled, and they resented Paul and Linda for bringing in a drug that they knew the country was very strict and had harsh laws about it. So it's not surprising that the band would not have the same camaraderie as they had before. This video doesn't end the story of Wings. The band still remained together at this time in the book, and the next video we'll see how the band did together after the Japan incident. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would be great. And also, if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, you'll get news of when a new video was going to be released. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon to the Beatles Forever for another episode. Thank you. Bye.